At the end of The Revenge of Frankenstein, the Baron had seemingly achieved the impossible. He successfully transferred his brain into a freshly constructed body, a facsimile of himself, which conveniently left the way open for a sequel.
In total, Hammer made 7 Frankenstein films, 6 of which starred Peter Cushing as Baron Frankenstein. Now, of those 6, all apart from one was directed by Terence Fisher. Evil of Frankenstein was directed by Freddie Francis, and so this is the one in the series that tends to divide fans. Terry Fisher was a natural for the Frankenstein series, and what he produced was richly gothic, very visceral medical thrillers. Freddie Francis said he wasn't very comfortable in that subject, and his film looks really more like a very colourful, thrilling adventure medical film. You always have to remember as well that this is the one of the series that was co-financed by Universal Pictures, and so it's a deliberate homage to the Universal series, which up until then Hammer had tried to avoid. Their first 2 films, Curse of Frankenstein and its direct sequel, Revenge of Frankenstein, Hammer made their own and tried to go away from everything that Universal had done before it, whereas now Evil of Frankenstein was a standalone film which had big remnants of the Universal series in it.
The film that emerged, retitled The Evil of Frankenstein, broke the close continuity between the first 2 films and instead opened with a specially filmed prologue of its own, featuring the Baron's own brand of open heart surgery.
The prop heart you see at the beginning of Evil of Frankenstein was created by Ian Scoons. Now, this was made out of latex, it was hollow, and inside there was a balloon, and this balloon was connected to an off-screen aqualung which Scoons operated, and just by switching it off and on he was able to make the heart suddenly beat as if by itself. Here's what I prepared earlier. One dead heart. Oh my God, it's alive. And simply by just pumping air in and out, it looks like it's beating by itself. And this is just how they did it in Evil of Frankenstein. Ian Scoons got his introduction to Hammer, in fact, by Peter Cushing. He got an invite for him to meet Bernard Robinson at Bray Studios, but unfortunately Bernard said there's no vacancy at that time in the art department. At that moment, fortuitously, a foot suddenly came through the ceiling above them, and that foot belonged to Les Bowie, the special effects supervisor at Hammer. Recently they'd had a fire at Bray Studios, and he was up in the attic to see if any of his material had survived, and he was coming down with charred storyboards from the Dam Busters. He was introduced to Scoons, showed some of Scoons' artwork, was impressed, and immediately snapped him up as an assistant in his department. Bowie was like this. He was a pioneer in special effects. In particular, he was a pioneer of matting techniques, and that's where you incorporate a glass painting with live action. And he was always keen to pass this information on to his younger recruits. Les Bowie set Scoons to work straight away on painting the mountains that transformed Black Park in Slough into the Swiss Alps for the prologue of Taste of Fear in 1960. Scoons also created the castle that you see explode at the climax. Now, this was just mainly a flat painting on hardboard with the sky in the background, apart from the turret on the right side, which was a 3-dimensional model made of small bricks. They blew up the model and they shot it at fast speed to give it scale. Ray Capel painted the matte painting of the valley and the hut that you see at the very beginning of Evil of Frankenstein when the grave robber is arriving. And Hammer loved that so much that they actually reused it at the beginning of both The Gorgon and Dracula Prince of Darkness.
The Baron and his new assistant are forced to flee to Karlstad, his ancestral home.
There it is.
Where he believes he will find the money to continue his work. Frankenstein is dismayed to discover that the residents of sleepy Karlstad have taken justice into their own hands, and his castle has been ransacked and his possessions looted. It's not all bad news, however. The Baron finds the unsuccessful outcome of an earlier experiment, embedded in ice, but otherwise unharmed. Frankenstein manages to revive the creature, only to discover its brain remains inactive. In a novel twist, he turns to Zoltan, a fairground hypnotist, to help to awaken the dormant brain.
Evil of Frankenstein was produced by Anthony Hines, and it was widely publicised that that particular film was his 50th film at Hammer. And so to celebrate that, Hammer put on a reception for him at the Savoy Hotel in London, inviting many of the behind-scenes people at Hammer, all the actors and other people from the industry.
The script was credited to John Elder, the nom de plume of Tony Hines, taking a short sabbatical from his executive duties at Hammer.
Hines hated seeing the same names come up in the credits, so what he wanted to avoid was to see screenplay by Tony Hines, produced by Tony Hines. And he took the name of John Elder from an old director, an art director who used to work for Hammer, a chap called James Elder Wills. Now, Tony Hines adopted some of the previous scripts at Hammer by Jimmy Sangster, and Hines' first full script for Hammer was in 1960 on The Curse of the Werewolf. This might be another reason why Evil of Frankenstein seems very different to the two that had become before it, Curse of Frankenstein and Revenge of Frankenstein. These films had been written by Jimmy Sangster, and one was a direct sequel to the other, whereas Hines decided to cut his story off from the other two, and it was a standalone film and actually tells the story of Frankenstein from scratch again.
The Elder-Hines script had none of the wry humour of Jimmy Sangster, and positioned the Baron as more sinned against than sinner. Frankenstein is as driven and ambitious as ever, but he seems constantly the victim of officious interference.
Why can't they leave me alone?
He cries at one point, while Hans looks on helplessly. With the mellowing of Frankenstein's character, the film introduces a true villain in the shape of the smug Zoltan, who sees the creature not as a breakthrough for medical science, but as a vehicle for his own revenge. The targets for the revenge are the petty bureaucrats who also looted the Baron's former home. With Terence Fisher unavailable, Tony Hines, in his capacity as producer, suggested Freddie Francis as a suitable replacement. Francis had enjoyed considerable success as a director of photography, winning the first of his 2 Oscars for Sons and Lovers in 1960. He'd already directed 2 films for Hammer, both modern-day thrillers, very much in the Hitchcock mould, Paranoiac and Nightmare.
Freddie was a lighting cameraman originally, and I think this was his first directing role. And David Hutchins, who played my husband, whilst we were waiting for the thing to be lit, while we were in bed, he was in his sort of pom-pom hat, with a striped bed cap, and I was in my low-neck dress. This was our wedding night. And he started doing funny things with the sheet, putting his hand under and pointing up the sheet, and I was in hysterics. And Freddie said, "Be quiet, you two, stop laughing, this is a serious matter." Because the monster was about to come in, and we couldn't be seen to be laughing. So we had to go, keep really quiet. I used to be frightened of spiders. So when he came in, I thought of all these black spiders crawling over me and getting really hysterical and sobbing. And that was my motivation. Well, this is what drama school, it was a very avant-garde type drama school where you had to improvise a lot. And I think that was a good idea. They didn't do that earlier on. The night dress was absolutely beautiful. It was satin and chiffon, and it was very low with a seam here. And then the costume I wore in the pub scene, that was velvet with trim and a beautiful hat with matching flowers, and it was a little veil. It was beautiful. It was great going to Bergman's because all the history of all these lovely things hanging up, I just used to go through all the costumes and look at them. I remember one time I wanted a dress to go to a premiere. So I phoned up Bergman's and I said, "Do you have anything glamorous I could wear?" And they said, "Oh, we've got a dress here that Jane Mansfield wore. See if that will fit you." And it was perfect. And I wore it for this theatre premiere of Things Ain't What They Used to Be. So that was it. You were wearing a dress that a famous star wore. And sometimes you could look in and see who wore it last. They sometimes leave their name in there.
Freddie Francis attacked Evil of Frankenstein with the eye of a photographer. What he made was a very striking, colourful film, and he knew the scenes that would be the most striking would be the laboratory scenes, and therefore he asked Tony Hines, the producer, if they could use a little bit more of the budget in embellishing the laboratory sets, and this is what they did, and they are the standout scenes in the movie. He never considered himself as a horror director. He just wanted the raw experience and loved making films, and Hammer came around just at the right time for it.
The director was the first to admit he had no particular attachment to the Gothic period in particular, or horror films in general, and later described his approach as, "Oh, here is the monster, here is the mad lab, and away we go."
He used to say to me, "I've got a little part for you," and he said, "You can do these sort of things standing on your head." And, that gave me a nice feeling, confidence. Yeah, and I think he enjoyed directing.
Continuity may have been broken, but Peter Cushing was back as the Baron, as commanding a screen presence as ever, in what was his first horror role since Brides of Dracula in 1960.
Peter Cushing was an award-winning television actor in the 50s. Now, at that time, you were either a television actor or a film actor, and Cushing had a contract with the BBC doing regular plays for them, and he did a little bit of film work in the background. Now, all that changed in 1956 when international stardom hit him after starring in The Curse of Frankenstein, consolidating that with Dracula. Now his film work started to clash with his television work, and the BBC were not amused, so over time he was given less and less television work to do, so that finally he was a film star. More importantly, he was a horror film star. Now, there did come a time in 1961, the Daily Express released it in the newspaper that the king of horror wants to abdicate, and that was the time he was getting worried about typecasting and decided to pull away from horror films. Now, 18 lean months ensued, not much work came his way. The first film he made after doing that was The Evil of Frankenstein.
Everybody rushed off for lunch, and there I was in this tight corselet, one of my other cleavage scenes in the bar, and I started to faint. I could feel myself going, and I'm propping myself up against the wall. And Peter Cushing turned back and he said, "Dear girl, let me help you out." And he said, "Turn around." And he undid all my lacing. So he said, "Now you can breathe." And I was able to go to lunch. I mean, that's the sort of man he was. He was an absolute gentleman.
This is Peter's nature. He was fastidious about the continuity of his props, his dress. He would have copious notes in his script, scene by scene, where applicable, of what props he had and where he may have not had that particular prop in another scene, what he was wearing, and if he was playing a certain role, or in the case of Frankenstein, he was having the expertise with the knife, a surgeon's knife, he would seek advice. I don't recall ever being a technical advisor on set, as one does have on film sets. Prior to him coming on set, he would make a point of seeking out the relevant person to get the way to cut parts of a human body or whatever.
I do remember when Peter Cushing was working on the body of Kiwi, and you were only just on Peter's sort of face, not on the body, he had to cut through bone, and he wanted the sound maybe, wanted sound effects. So a cabbage was brought onto set, and off, as Peter was, I think Peter himself was cutting through a cabbage, which gave the right sound for going into the bone or whatever. I do remember they used cabbage for the sound effect. I remember that. It was quite a laugh. We tried to have to keep a straight face.
Whilst the Universal Frankenstein series concentrated on the monster, Hammer's Frankenstein series revolved around Baron Frankenstein. And Peter Cushing was a perfectionist. He always used to go to his doctor and ask how to do operations, ask about the anatomy, ask how to hold the instruments.
You see, whenever I have to do any of these operations, I always go to my local doctor, who's, I must say, he's always delighted to see me because he knows I'm not ill. I've come to ask him how to take a brain out. Because you must pick up the right instrument in the correct way, and even if it's out of shot, you must do things correctly.
His argument was that there might be a doctor in the audience, and he had to convince that doctor as much as all the lay people. As a result, he is the most convincing Baron Frankenstein on screen, and he really does define the Hammer series.
Universal Studios had long since dropped any reservations they had about their intellectual property rights and allowed James Carreras a free run at some of their classic monsters.
Roy Ashton's creativity was compromised. He had an edict from the producers. He had to copy the classic Jack Pierce, Boris Karloff monster maker, because this was the film that was being co-financed by Universal Pictures.
This closer collaboration meant that, for the first time, Hammer were free to use the Karloff makeup designs as their starting point for the new creature.
So what Ashton did first of all was to do lots and lots of drawings to show the producers. And these were all based on different types of makeup, again based on the Karloff makeup. And the producer decided on design number 112. So once he got that basic design, Kiwi Kingston had been cast by then. He got a plaster cast of his head and he started to design the makeup in plasticine over it. It took ages making this lovely plasticine head to show the producers of what his creation would look like. And then he nipped out the office. When he came back in, there was a deep gouge stuck in the top of the skull. Who on earth has done this? The producers came in later and says, oh yeah, we saw that and we thought, I wonder what it would be like if you put that big gouge in there. No, we don't really like it. So do it as you were doing before. And he was annoyed by that.
The final design picked up on Karloff's flat head, the lumbering physicality, and raised shoes to accentuate the height.
He then had the go-ahead to trial the makeup on Kiwi Kingston himself. And his basic premise for the makeup was that the cranium was going to be open to get to the brain, and he wanted to show the crude surgery at that time. So the top would then be crudely sewn together with these great big thongs. Actually, the sutures that he used were bootlaces. Now, what sets Hammer Films out from their contemporaries in the late 50s and the early 60s is how good the monster makeup was. You'll see some very awful low-budget horror films around that time where the makeup is just appalling.
In an effort to build the suspense, the makeup design was kept secret. No publicity pictures were issued, and visitors banned from the set.
However, the Evil of Frankenstein makeup on Kiwi Kingston looks like a static papier-mâché mask, and there is no humanity in the face at all, and to me it doesn't look scary. Now Ashton knew this, and it was basically down to the interference by the producers. That said, Freddie Francis always used to say that Kiwi Kingston was actually cast for his hulking frame, not for his acting ability.
Kiwi Kingston was such a lovely man, and I used to smile when he walked in with this monster suit, and he'd say, "Had a fight last night." You know, he'd fight the night before and then be on the set early, being papier-mâchéed up again. But we talked a lot, and although he was a big 6'4" wrestler, or maybe 6'5", he had a pony field where he collected ponies that had been discarded, and he looked after them until they died. That's the sort of man he was. And you've got, you know, this sort of big monster, a wrestler, for looking after these old ponies.
Ashton even incorporated the famous Frankenstein monster bolts, but while Karloff had them on his neck, Hammer incorporated them on the creature's head. The press book later boasted, "Only by seeing the picture will the public be able to judge for themselves whether or not the latest Frankenstein creation will earn its place in the distinguished ranks of movie history." Where Hammer did diverge from Universal was on the casting of the monster. James Whale had cast Boris Karloff for his gaunt, evocative face, which provided a canvas for make-up man Jack Pierce. Freddie Francis chose his creature because of his sheer physical size. Kiwi Kingston was a 6'5" professional wrestler with no previous acting experience, and Francis emphasized in several interviews that he wanted a creature that towered over the Baron. Kingston certainly radiates enormous physical power, but the creature lacks the emotional impact that Christopher Lee or Michael Gwynne inspired. The fact that the creature is supposed to be practically brain dead further hinders characterization, and for the most part, Kingston is reduced to stomping round the set, grunting and smashing things up.
Get her out of here.
Supporting the Baron and playing Hans was Sándor Ellis,
Go on!
the Hungarian-born actor who had been playing exotic foreigners on British television for a number of years. Stealing the scenes whenever he appeared was Peter Woodthorpe, who oozed oily menace as the duplicitous Zoltan. Woodthorpe, a promising stage actor who would work for Francis again on the Amicus film.
The skull. Get out of my way.
Unusual for a Hammer film, the heroine is not presented as an alluring sex object. Hines' script moved away from Hazel Court and Eunice Gayson with their plunging necklines and elaborate hairstyles, and instead introduced Cathy Wilde as an orphaned waif, a feral child dressed in rags and living on scraps. We later learn she was struck dumb in a previous off-screen encounter with the monster, but has nonetheless managed to establish a bond with the creature. Credited only as beggar girl in the script, she reintroduces Frankenstein to his failed experiment. The evil of Frankenstein managed to incorporate a number of plot devices from the old Universal series, including the monster's icy tomb, overzealous burgomasters, and muttering peasants. Even the laboratory sequences, underplayed in the earlier Hammer films, owed their inspiration to Hollywood rather than Mary Shelley. The man charged with creating the production design was Don Mingay, who had worked on a number of Hammer films, including The Curse of the Werewolf, The Phantom of the Opera, and The Kiss of the Vampire. Mingay was given around 10% of the film's modest £130,000 to create the sets, including the impressive laboratory and the abandoned castle.
Now, it was often said that it was impossible to tell what Bernard Robinson did and what Don Mingay did. They really worked as a fused team.
We had a close relationship in that sense of on a friendly basis and a mutual basis. Liking the same things in furniture design and stuff like that. Bernard would make terrific lists, prop lists for our buyer, and so on. And as I say, over the years, working closely with him, a lot of it rubbed off me, and I found, well, obviously I took what I found useful from it, and there wasn't much to discard really, because I found that it was a joy to work with.
And you don't actually miss Robinson. The sets look exactly the same as the films that they do when they work together. All that detail is still there.
Well, he came in with a great flourish, and I thought he was coming for me.
I've come for my property, burgomaster.
And I got all excited to think, oh, he's going to jump into bed with me or something. The next thing I know, he's efficiently tying the sheet, and the next thing, the bed goes flying like that. I nearly fell out, and off he goes. I thought, oh, is that it?
Good night.
Hammer were renowned for their fantastic fiery climaxes. Now, these were set up by the special effects department, but very safely. The foreground flames were produced by fishtail burners, which were put up close to the camera, whereas the background set was flame retardant, so they were able to control the flames on it, extinguish them quickly, and relight them for further takes. Now, at the end of Evil of Frankenstein, you'll see Peter Cushing swing into the middle of the burning laboratory. Now, they wanted a stuntman to do that, but Cushing said, no, I want to do it, and in the end they allowed him to do it. Now, the area he was swinging into was quite safe. It was a long way away from the flames. But what no one actually appreciated was the intense heat that was being generated on the set by these flames. And he actually did get burned by the searing heat. The film score for Evil of Frankenstein was by Don Banks, an Australian composer who was really good at making really exciting scores. And it really goes with Evil of Frankenstein to make it a very exciting movie. On a sad note, the music supervisor on the film was John Hollingsworth, who'd worked on a lot of Hammer's earlier films, including their big classic Dracula, and unfortunately he died during post-production, and he was replaced by Philip Martell, who later went on to become Hammer's mainline music supervisor.
Premiered at the New Victoria in London on the 19th of April 1964, The Evil of Frankenstein failed to impress the critics. At least Variety found time to compliment the leading man. Peter Cushing, they noted, plays the Baron with his usual seriousness. Some of his fellow thesps tend to ham it up to the make-believe's detriment. Given the relatively disappointing box office performance that followed, it is curious that American television thought it worthwhile shooting additional sequences for the film's debut on the small screen. The new scenes included a new subplot which explains away the beggar girl's handicap without featuring any of the main players or intruding on the main storyline. It is also worth mentioning the film marked the introduction to Hammer of a young accountant called Roy Skeggs. Engaged initially on a short-term contract, he would become a significant figure in Hammer's future.